My name is Julian, and for 24 years, I was the invisible shadow in a family that measured human worth by the weight of their bank accounts and the prestige of their social standing. My father was the CEO of a global investment firm, and my mother was a woman who valued diamonds more than the pulse of her own children, but specifically she valued my older brother Sebastian more than anything else in the world. Sebastian was the golden child, the athlete, the Harvard graduate who could do no wrong, while I was the quiet son who preferred the solitude of coding and financial theory over the loud galas and fake smiles of the upper class. On the day I graduated from college with honors, my parents didn't celebrate. Instead, my father handed me a cardboard box and told me that my room was being converted into a private gym for Sebastian, and that I was to move into the gardener's shed behind the estate. They treated me like a servant, forcing me to handle the family's menial digital tasks while Sebastian was given a $10 million fund to play with. I was the one who fixed their broken servers. I was the one who managed their private accounts for no pay while they sat at dinner tables discussing how I was a disappointment to the family name. The final straw came during a Christmas dinner when Sebastian laughed and dumped a glass of expensive red wine over my head in front of their wealthy friends, claiming that a servant like me needed to be refreshed. My parents didn't stop him. They laughed along with the crowd. That night, I took my laptop, a few $100s I had hidden away, and I walked out of that estate into the freezing rain without a jacket or a goodbye. The city lights looked like cold, distant stars as I walked for hours with water soaking through my thin shoes and the weight of betrayal feeling heavier than the backpack on my shoulders. I found a tiny room in the industrial district that smelled of old grease and damp walls, but to me it was a palace because it was the first place where I didn't have to hear Sebastian's mocking laughter. I spent the next year working 3 jobs during the day, delivering packages, cleaning offices, and working as a night watchman. Also, I could spend my dawn hours writing the code for a high-frequency trading algorithm that I had been dreaming about since I was 16. I lived on a diet of stale bread and tap water while my body grew thin, but my mind became a weapon of pure logic and data. Every time my muscles ached or my stomach growled, I thought about the red wine dripping from my hair and the way my father looked at me, like I was dirt under his expensive boots. I realized that my family hadn't just thrown me out. They had inadvertently set me free from the rot of their expectations. By the second year, my algorithm caught the attention of a silent partner who saw the raw genius in my work and provided the initial capital to launch my firm. I chose the name Obsidian Capital because obsidian is a stone born from the fire of a volcano, much like I was born from the fire of their rejection. I operated from behind a wall of anonymous corporations, ensuring that the name Julian Sullivan remained a forgotten memory while Obsidian Capital began to ripple through the financial markets like a silent predator. While I was building my empire in the shadows, I kept a constant watch on the Sullivan family through my private intelligence network, and what I saw was a slow-motion train wreck fueled by arrogance and greed. Sebastian had used his $10 million fund to start a lifestyle brand that was nothing more than a front for his extravagant parties and private jet trips. He was bleeding money, while my father was so blinded by pride that he kept funneling the family's core assets into Sebastian's failing ventures. They were taking out massive, high-interest loans and leveraging the family estate to keep up the appearance of wealth in front of their socialite friends. My mother was still buying couture gowns while the foundations of their mansion were literally and figuratively rotting away. I watched as they made one bad investment after another until they were eventually caught in a liquidity trap that I had subtly prepared for them. I started buying up their distressed debt from the banks, not all at once, but piece by piece, until I held the keys to their entire existence. I was the landlord of their office building, the holder of their mortgage, and the primary creditor of their failing firm. To the world, Obsidian Capital was a mysterious savior, but to the Sullivans, I was the storm they never saw coming. I spent my 31st birthday sitting in my glass penthouse overlooking the city, realized that the disappointment of the family was now the owner of the family legacy. The stage was set for the final act of a play that began with a glass of red wine. The call I had been waiting for finally came on a Tuesday afternoon when my father's secretary reached out to Obsidian Capital, begging for an emergency meeting to discuss a restructuring of their debt. They were desperate, and they didn't know that the CEO of Obsidian Capital was the son they had discarded 7 years ago. I scheduled the meeting for Friday at their own family estate because I wanted the confrontation to happen on the very ground where I was humiliated. I arrived in a sleek black car, but I didn't wear a flashy suit. I wore a simple black turtleneck and the same worn-out watch my grandfather had given me, the only person who ever truly loved me. As I walked up the driveway, I saw the gardener's shed where I used to live, and I felt a cold sense of closure. The front doors were opened by a butler who looked older and more tired than I remembered. When I walked into the dining room, my father was sitting at the head of the table surrounded by stacks of legal papers, while Sebastian was pacing back and forth with a panicked expression. My mother was clutching a glass of wine, her hands shaking, as she realized that their world was about to end. They looked at me as I entered, but for a few seconds they didn't recognize the man I had become. I was taller, broader, and my eyes held the weight of 1,000 battles they would never understand. My father stood up and began his rehearsed speech. about the importance of their firm and why Obsidian Capital should provide them with a bridge loan to save their legacy. I let him speak for 10 full minutes without saying a single word, because I wanted to hear every hollow excuse and every lie he had told himself to justify his failure. He talked about Sebastian's unfortunate market timing and my mother's necessary social expenses as if they were victims of fate rather than their own stupidity. When he finally finished, he looked at me with an expectant smile, waiting for me to pull out a checkbook. I slowly reached into my pocket, but I didn't pull out a pen. I pulled out a small silver spoon, the same one I used to eat with in the gardener's shed. I placed it on the mahogany table and watched as the color drained from my father's face. The silence that followed was so thick that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a hammer against an anvil. My mother dropped her glass and it shattered on the floor, echoing the moment. Her heart must have stopped. Sebastian stopped pacing and stared at me, his jaw hanging open in disbelief. I leaned forward and looked my father directly in his cold blue eyes. I told him that Obsidian Capital wasn't here to save them. It was here to inform them that the foreclosure was complete. I told them that, as of 9 o'clock that morning, I was the official owner of the house, the firm, and every luxury asset they had left. I told Sebastian that his lifestyle brand was officially liquidated and that he was now unemployed. The look of absolute terror in their eyes was better than any profit I had ever made in the stock market. Sebastian was the first to find his voice, but instead of an apology, he began to scream about how I was a traitor and how I had stolen what belonged to him. I simply reminded him that he was the one who dumped wine on my head and told me that I was a servant. I told him that a servant doesn't own the house, but a king does. My mother started to sob, begging for mercy and telling me that she always loved me in her own way, but I silenced her by pointing at the shed through the window. I asked her where that love was when I was shivering in the rain while she was picking out new curtains. My father tried to use his judge voice to tell me that I couldn't do this legally, but I reminded him that I had spent 7 years learning every law and every loophole he ever used to crush others. I told him that he was no longer a judge. He was just a man with a lot of debt and nowhere to go. I gave them exactly 48 hours to pack their designer clothes and leave. I told them that they could keep their personal items, but the furniture, the cars, and the family name stayed with me. I watched them scramble to understand the reality of their situation, that the person they mocked for being fireless had just burned their entire world to the ground. I didn't feel a drop of guilt. I felt a profound sense of balance. The scales of justice had finally tipped back in my direction, and I was the one holding the weights. I walked out of that room and left them in the silence of their own making. The next 48 hours were a chaotic spectacle. As moving trucks arrived to take away the remnants of a life built on vanity, I watched from my car as my mother carried out her designer bags, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, and as Sebastian tried to argue with the movers about a painting that I had already claimed as company property. My father walked out last, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in 2 days. He looked at me one last time, but he didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I didn't keep the estate for myself. I had already signed the paperwork to turn the mansion into a rehabilitation center for young adults who had been discarded by their families. I wanted the halls that once echoed with arrogance to be filled with the sounds of people healing and finding their own strength. I moved into a modest apartment in the heart of the city because I realized that I didn't need a mansion to feel powerful. I carried my power within me. I began to systematically rebuild the family firm from the ground up, firing every person who had helped Sebastian hide his illegal trades and hiring the people who had been overlooked because of their background. I turned the Sullivan legacy into the Julian legacy, a legacy built on merit, hard work, and integrity. I spent my evenings at the new center talking to the kids and telling them that the darkness they were in wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of their rise. I became the mentor that I never had, and I found more joy in their success than I ever did in my own bank balance. 2 years passed and the world had forgotten the fall of the Sullivans and was now focused on the meteoric rise of Obsidian Global. I was no longer a secret. I was a leader in the industry, known for my ruthlessness in business and my compassion in philanthropy. One day I was walking through the city center when I saw a man sitting on a bench wearing a tattered coat and looking at a discarded newspaper. It was Sebastian. He looked hollow and defeated, his face worn by the reality of a life without a silver spoon. He didn't see me, and for a moment, I thought about walking over to him and gloating, but I realized that I didn't need to. His life was his punishment. He was living in the world he once thought was below him, and he was discovering that without money, he was nothing. I walked past him and felt nothing but a slight pity for a man who never learned how to be a human being. My mother had moved to a small town to live with a distant relative, and my father was working as a low-level legal consultant, struggling to make ends meet. They were living the boring, stable life they had once threatened to give me. I realized that my revenge was complete, not because they were suffering, but because I was thriving. I had taken their weapons and used them to build a shield for others. I had turned my trauma into a kingdom and my pain into a purpose. Every morning I wake up and I look at the old silver spoon on my nightstand, and I smile because it reminds me of where I came from and how far I've gone. I decided to launch a global initiative called the Shadow Project, designed to provide funding and mentorship to children who were considered outcasts or failures by their families. I wanted to create a network of invisible geniuses who could change the world from the shadows just like I did. The project became a massive success, and soon I was surrounded by a new family. Family of choice built on shared struggle and mutual respect. I realized that the Sullivans hadn't just lost their money. They had lost the chance to be part of something truly great. I often think back to that Christmas dinner and the wine dripping down my face, and I realized that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was the moment I realized that I didn't belong in their world and that I was meant to build my own. I stopped looking back and started looking forward to a future where your birth doesn't define your worth. I met a woman who didn't care about my billions, but cared about the way I treated the kids at the center, and for the first time in my life, I felt a love that wasn't conditional. We built a life together that was based on truth rather than social standing, and I finally understood what a real family looked like. I am Julian, and I am no longer a shadow. I am the sun that rose from the ashes of a house of gold. As I stand on the balcony of my office today watching the sunset over the city, I realize that the greatest success is not the money or the power, but the peace of mind that comes from knowing you stayed true to yourself when everyone else wanted you to break. My father's firm is now the most ethical investment house in the country, and the estate is now a place where hundreds of lives are being saved every year. I am no longer defined by the rejection of my past, but by the impact of my present. I learned that the world will try to tell you who you are, but you are the only one with the pen to write your own story. If you are in a dark place right now, if you feel like a shadow in your own life, just remember that the most brilliant fires are often born in the coldest places. Keep building, keep dreaming, and never let them see you coming until it's too late for them to stop you. I am Julian, and this is my legacy. Not one of gold and silver, but one of resilience and fire. The Sullivans are a footnote in history, while the light I created will shine long after I am gone. The journey from the shed to the penthouse was long and painful, but I would walk every single mile again if it meant becoming the man I am today. I am free, I am powerful, and I am finally home.